When you are judging at Easters, you'll be expected to fill out ballots after each debate, which gives speaker scores to every individual speaker, which reflects their individual performance within that debate. This video will explain what exactly are speaker scores and how to give them. The first thing to know about speaker scores is they lie on a very limited scale from 70 to 80. This is a scale that we'll be using for Easters in particular, which is different to the scale used by the British parliamentary system, for instance. 70 would be the worst speech that you might see in a tournament, with 80 being probably the best speech that you might see at a tournament. 72 to 74 is probably a relatively weaker speech, with 77 to 78 being a very strong speech. 75 to 76 does the basics and is what we would consider the tournament average. Notably, the tournament average varies at different tournaments. That means that the bar that you would use to assess Easters level speech and whether it hits a 75 or not is probably lower than the bar that you would use to assess a Worlds level speech with a lot of pros debating in it. So the Easters 75 to 76 would be somewhat lower than the one that you might use in other tournaments, but it should reflect the average of that particular tournament. When you are giving speaker scores, there are three main things that you should assess. The first thing you should assess is how much did a speaker individually contribute to a debate. Note that this is different to how well did a speaker speak in abstract terms, or how good a speaker sounded. If a speaker made a speech which sounded rhetorically very convincing, but didn't do anything to actually contribute to them winning the debate, logically or mechanistically, that is not a speech that you should be giving a high score, no matter how nice their voice sounded or their accent sounded. The speaker score that you give should be about that contribution to them winning the debate, or how close they made it when they were losing. The second thing is that speaker score should be a holistic assessment of a speech. You should not be giving points for them ticking certain boxes in a speech. You should not be taking away points because they made a particular error in their speech. Speaker scores is not about what exactly you're doing in your speech, which is categorized as a 75 or a 76. It should be a holistic assessment that uses your judgment of the speech as a whole. That means even if a speech, say, misses an introduction or doesn't do signposting, but is extremely persuasive and wins the debate, you can still give them a very high score because you are doing a holistic assessment of how much they contributed to a debate, rather than doing a check of how many boxes they ticked in what you would consider to be a good speech. Lastly, the speaker score should be relative to the rest of the debate. If a speaker spoke worse than the teammates on their team, you should be giving them a lower speaker score than their teammates. Similarly, if they spoke the best in the debate, you should be giving them a higher speaker score than the rest of the debate. One thing to remember is that in Easters at least, there are no low point wins, which means that one team cannot get higher total speaks than the other team, but still lose the debate. The winning team in any debate must always have the highest speaker scores. That is not to say that you would change who won based on who you think had the highest speaks. The priority should always be determining who won and then making sure that they're getting higher speaks than the other team. So remember, when you're checking over your ballots, that the winning team needs to have higher speaker scores than the losing team. And you may need to adjust some speaker scores to reflect that when they have won a debate. The last tip to remember is to use the range. There's been a common trend, especially in Australian judging, to keep the range very, very narrow. Often you'll see ballots where everyone in the debate gets a 77. While this can seem safe from a judging perspective, I would advise you to use the entire breadth of the range. And there's two reasons for this. Firstly, speakers often look to their speaker scores after a debate, and they look on the tab to assess how well they did. And speaker scores then often are a useful form of feedback. That feedback is useless if you are giving everyone in debate 77. In addition, speaker scores are useful for determining the break at a tournament. And we want speaker scores to be relatively distinct so that breaks are meritocratic. Use the range when you are giving speaker scores, and make sure that you are giving speaker scores which reflect people's performance, rather than using the range to artificially make a debate seem closer than it actually is. So that is the last thing to remember. Use the range when you are giving speaker scores.